bread and butter, peanut butter and jelly, Dragon Ball Z, and fight scenes. Dragon Ball's mangaka Akira Toriyama was an absolutely excellent panelist, and I think this is something we can all agree on. It's because of his understanding of panel flow that the anime adaptation translated said panels into insanely stylistic, fast-paced fights. I mean, sure, they're not as intricate and flashy as the heaviest hitters we're seeing today, but even on a much tighter production schedule, and with heavy usage of limited animation, I can't say there was ever a moment I was not engaged with the fight scenes the anime put in front of me. But to pin my enjoyment primarily on the quality of its animation or its choreography would be a bit of a misnomer. Don't get me wrong, I won't deny that I'm certainly a sucker for that Kimetsu no Yaiba, Jujutsu Kaisen stylized animation spectacle salad we've been getting the past half-decade, but to me the battle itself is only half the battle. Something I assume many of you may understand and agree with, because if I were to ask quite a number of you what you all thought made a fight scene excellent, you'd probably be quick to express that it's the emotional conflict behind the fight. You may turn your attention to something like Naruto. Much of Naruto's fights, especially its most integral ones, focus around the emotional weight of its participants, and that's something that results in its fights maintaining a presence in the mind of those who watched it, as even a decade out from its conclusion, its fanbase still evokes the name of Gaara vs. Rock Lee, Naruto vs. Sasuke, Kakashi vs. Spoilers, and this effort to build fights entirely around more emotional stakes is pretty common throughout the entire shonen genre these days, something that, for many, makes Dragon Ball feel a little antiquated. Dragon Ball fights were more than capable of basing themselves in the character's emotional state, but more often than not, the primary conflict of its fight scenes began and ended on whether or not character A was more powerful than character B. Not only this, given Dragon Ball's power system, Ki is a very straightforward, to-the-point power system that doesn't really lend itself to the intricate tactics seen in other shonen like JoJo, Hunter x Hunter, Naruto, or Jujutsu Kaisen. Often Dragon Ball fights can be boiled down to two guys punching the shit out of each other until the one with the bigger power wins. So with that all in mind, you may assume that Dragon Ball's fights are relatively hollow, and its abundance of them, often in quick succession, an enormous weakness of the story. But that's where you'd be incorrect. Dragon Ball's fights end up having way more moving parts than people often realize, and I think this element of Dragon Ball storytelling needs to be highlighted, because no doubt in my mind it's a huge part of as to why Dragon Ball maintains a sense of relevancy in the world of anime despite its age. Take for example, the readability of its action. Toriyama's ability to present incredibly readable, easily digestible action panels is something that's already widely discussed, but I think this goes even beyond just paneling, as even the anime's action has a flow to it that's very easy to understand and digest, and I'd like to believe this can be pinned on a number of things. Firstly is the simplicity of Dragon Ball's power system, Ki. Battle Shounen, coming out in the years after Dragon Ball and North Star, strove to iterate on the power system of Ki, which both anime shared, and that resulted in progressively more elaborate, detailed, and complex systems until we've landed on systems like Nen, Cursed Energy, and even long before either of those, stands. Their immense versatility, while still being more than capable of sticking closely to their large rules, has gotten significant praise from the anime community, and it's why they're all held in such strong regard. But I do think that adoration for complex power systems has led people to overlook the appeal and advantages of simple power systems. Often in manga and anime with more complex power systems, it's easy for the fights to either become hard to follow, no thanks to the various moving parts that make up the power system the characters are using, or for those moving parts to slow the pacing of the action down as the characters have to sit back and remind us how all the power stuff works. Don't get the wrong idea, this isn't to say complex power systems are secretly bad, and these aren't intrinsically issues, especially if you, say, love paying attention to all the details of said system or can allow yourself to entirely invest in the action sequences of anime and manga with these habits. But these two elements do limit the appeal of these shows somewhat. There's a reason that, despite its many issues, Kimetsu no Yaiba speaks to so many people over in Japan. Its action is not only well animated, but also really easy to understand, and this also goes for Dragon Ball Z as well. Once Ki is introduced, you know pretty much everything you need to know about the system. Characters have inner strength that gives them access to a number of inhuman abilities, such as making their physical attack stronger, using energy blasts. This system is so straightforward that nobody has to sit and explain the ins and outs of how Ki works like ever in Dragon Ball Z, so the story is allowed to simply focus on the action. That being said, Key's simplicity has resulted in the common assessment and attitude that Dragon Ball fights are simply about who has the bigger power, because there isn't exactly much strategy involved in fights using Key. And to an extent, I do agree with this assessment, but I do think when people say this, they're very much missing the forest for the trees here. I mean, let's be real here, do fights specifically need a level of strategic depth to keep audiences engaged with the conflict? Is there simply no other way to guarantee you keep them invested in your action? See, Dragon Ball Z, as far as I'm concerned, avoids the issue of its fights just being nothing burger punch fests where two guys beat each other up until the stronger guy wins because of a couple of things. Firstly, the way the fights flow in the story. Dragon Ball fights, at least the major ones, are built around set pieces. Fights are segmented into standalone conflicts where the dynamics of those involved are built around a particular kind of interaction. When Goku and Vegeta begin their fight, the fight's first segment is centered on a pretty expected face-to-face confrontation where the two come to blows. It starts with Goku and Vegeta appearing evenly matched before it becomes clear that Vegeta still maintains a substantial lead in terms of power and speed, even with Goku's new Kaioken technique, forcing Goku to push himself to the max with a risky ×3 Kaioken maneuver that grants him the power and speed to overpower Vegeta at the cost of his health. Once the fight establishes this dynamic, Vegeta is more powerful than regular base Goku, so Goku must forcefully increase his strength beyond what his body can handle to outpace Vegeta. We enter our second segment. Vegeta utilizes a makeshift moon to transform himself into a great ape, significantly widening the gap in power, skill, and speed, establishing that Goku on his own is incapable of beating Vegeta, forcing Gohan and Krillin to interfere, turning this into a 3v1. Are you getting the idea? This is a common setup throughout many of Dragon Ball Z's action. The story always makes sure to keep us on our toes by dynamically changing the flow of combat around its competitors. In the fight with Frieza, we start with Goku and Frieza appearing evenly matched, but progressively Frieza pulls ahead significantly. So our second set piece follows Goku taking advantage of his only advantage on Frieza, which is his inability to sense Ki. Once it becomes clear this won't be enough, we enter set piece 3, which focuses on Goku's attempts to create a spirit bomb strong enough to defeat Frieza, which proves to be an enormous risk when it's a move he can only create when he's incredibly focused and not actively fighting. Now, that being said, many of you who are more than familiar with Dragon Ball Z may be aware that this isn't the case for all of Dragon Ball Z's action. In fact, you could make the argument that this isn't the case for at least half of the fights in Dragon Ball Z, primarily the more minor ones that fill up the arcs before the final climax, such as Android 18 vs Vegeta, the Dragon Team vs the Cybermen, or Vegeta vs Dodoria, Zarbon, or Kui. These fights are often the stronger guy wins LOL, but this is the moment where I need to sit down and really ask, does that intrinsically make these fights bad? Is there not more to the conflicts than this potentially surface level observation? I feel I must raise the question, what is the purpose of action in Battle Shounen? I think many anime fans, especially those more privy to the inner workings of storytelling, make the mistake of assuming that fights are primarily about the emotion. They perpetuate the attitude that the purpose of action is primarily about relaying the emotions the characters are holding on to, that fights serve as a conduit for exploring our characters on a fundamental level, an attitude which, mind you, is certainly not incorrect, but it leads to an all too common scenario where people turn their attention to Dragon Ball, look at its fights and ask, what's the point of something like the fight between the Dragon Team and Frieza, the Dragon Team versus Cell? People look at this kind of stuff and ask, what's the point? While that assessment, that fights are meant to be conduits of emotion expressed through action, is certainly not incorrect, it's much more circumstantial than you might think. Not all fights are, or should be like that. Certainly, those types are meant to weigh on audiences' minds much more, and those that fill the most important role in the storyline are mostly written like that, but that's not entirely all there is to action in Battle Shounen. A good fight asks us a question, and how it answers that question is the key to engaging us in the story the action tells. I want to briefly shout out Mr. Fusion, who, despite what I like to say about them on Blue Sky, to me is the GOAT of Dragon Ball YouTubing. But almost a decade ago now, they said something about Goku and Frieza's fight that has always stuck with me. They sat back and expressed that this fight wasn't Goku's, that Goku and Frieza are two strangers. Goku has no deeper meaning in this conflict other than being the one that shows up last minute and saves the day. And therefore, the fight story is lesser than something like Goku and Vegeta, where even though the two don't know each other, Vegeta poses the question, can a low-class warrior surpass a Saiyan elite like Vegeta? I think an assessment like that entirely misunderstands the story being told here. Maybe what we're presented with isn't as exciting as if, say, Goku and Frieza had some sort of long-standing history or some deeper level of connection before this, but I don't think the way their conflict is presented is nearly as lame as they and many others may suggest. Goku vs. Frieza, in story initially, is framed almost like a dream match. Bruce Lee vs. Jackie Chan, Tyson vs. Ali, the immovable object Frieza, hyped by every single character good and bad in this arc, so concerning that even God himself fears the tyrant, versus the unstoppable force Goku, who despite all opposition, never fails to come out of the other side stronger. Goku, who stands head and shoulders above all of his allies in strength, no matter how hard they struggle to catch up, a status quo that's been in place since the very beginning of this story. So the question becomes, in a clash of titans, who will reign supreme? Before this, Krillin, Gohan, Vegeta, and Piccolo all fought Frieza in what was slowly becoming a very obvious losing effort, raising the question, how long could the heroes hold off until Goku arrives? When Vegeta fights 18, it asks if the androids are even a quarter as bad as Trunks suggests they are in his timeline. Will Vegeta even be able to survive fighting just one of them? With the Dragon Team vs. Cell, it asks, can our main characters prevent Cell from reaching his perfect form? Then you have a fight like Gohan and Cell, where it initially asks the question, can Gohan take control of the potential we all know he has in order to defeat Cell? And once that question is answered, what follows is a devious-ass beatdown where Gohan does nothing but bully and humiliate Cell for every inconvenience he dared to commit against the people of Earth. And that may sound strange because during this segment of the fight our question has been answered, so what exactly are we supposed to chew on that isn't just the action? The thing is, once a fight answers its central question, often it doesn't simply end there. In many cases, we go from tension to catharsis, like in the case of the aforementioned fight where we spent some time simply watching Gohan obliterate Cell with his overwhelming strength. And we see this quite often in Dragon Ball Z. Goku vs. Nappa is primarily about Goku completely humiliating him, following almost an entire arc of Nappa completely steamrolling the majority of the Dragon Team. Likewise, Vegeta vs. Majin Buu sees Vegito embarrassing Buu over and over and over in so many incredible, inconceivable ways, after the show spent so much time showcasing Buu as an unstoppable and all-powerful force of nature. It's these things in Dragon Ball Z that keeps the action from being boring, from feeling superfluous. The point I have been trying to illustrate throughout this entire video, from talking about the meaning of action, the structure, the very power system that fuels the conflict in Dragon Ball Z, is that there is something incredibly deliberate about the action in Dragon Ball that helps it stand out, that keeps us coming back, that ensures audiences are glued to their screen. The idea that Dragon Ball's action is indeliberate, superfluous, and at times self-indulgent, based on my rewatch of Dragon Ball Z, has puzzled me. There was something so magical about revisiting Dragon Ball Z, getting engaged in its many fight scenes, and coming to realize that I wasn't as insane as I had begun to think I was as a child for becoming so invested in them. Sure, I will concede that the stories that guide that action are often very simplistic in nature and nowhere near as emotionally strong as the stuff we've been seeing in recent years, but I don't think that means what is here is less valuable. Newer anime fans like to second-guess Dragon Ball storytelling, but upon closer inspection, its popularity and impact wasn't so incidental. The heart and soul of Dragon Ball, as it is for many Battle Shounen, is its action. And Toriyama perfectly understood what it took to keep us turning those pages, tuning in week after week, and it's no thanks to that Dragon Ball maintains its position as one of the most beloved, well-regarded old-school anime classics. Because while its fights may not be made up of the components many assume help create good conflict, they're still filled with the storytelling, meaning, and most importantly, soul that keeps us coming back, even 40 years later.